Okay. Let me welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Really, I'm very happy and excited with our session. And I would first want to start by sending you greetings from Costa Rica and our Earth Charter Education Center on Education for Sustainable Development that is located here on this beautiful campus of the University for Peace. I am Miriam Vilela. I'm very happy to see some familiar faces here. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Charter International and our Education Center on ESD. And I'll be your host and moderator for today's session. This masterclass is part of a new masterclass program that we are offering this year, one in English, Spanish, and Portuguese in different languages, and which is part of our UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development that we have been working for the past over 10 years, which involves research and training and education on that intersection of values, ethics, sustainability, and education. But today we have a very special opportunity to be with Jeremy Lent on the theme of ecological civilization. As some of you may know, Jeremy is a writer and author of several books. What I didn't know is that he's a former internet company CEO, and I thought it was quite interesting. In his latest book, that's called The Web of Meaning, in which I had the pleasure of reading last year and having a webinar with Jeremy on it, Jeremy shares a few clues on the ideas or on the path that could lead us towards a new ecological civilization. David Corden says that Jeremy is one of the most brilliant and insightful minds of our age and has written one of the most essential and compelling books of our time. And of course, I fully agree with David on that statement. Before I give the floor to Jeremy, I want to first invite you to introduce yourself. For those I have seen some of you have started introducing yourselves in the chat box. You can share your name, where you're located, or where do you work if you wish, so that people start seeing who is in the room. And let me also start by sharing with you how we are going to spend these next 2 hours. I'm going to give the floor to Jeremy. He's going to give about 40 minutes presentation. We will have a very short Q&A. We're going to split you in breakout rooms with some questions, and also to give you a space to reflect and exchange views. We'll come back to the plenary, and Jeremy will share a second part of the presentation with another about 40 minutes presentation. Again, breakout rooms and Q&A, longer Q&A at the end before we close. So with this, Jeremy, I'm very happy, honored, and excited to give you the floor. Please, and thank you so much for being here with us, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, thank you, Miriam, for that lovely introduction. And tell you, I'm so excited to be sharing these ideas and thoughts with you over the next couple of hours. And thank you to all of you. And I know some of you are in places that are not too amenable to this time frame. I know there's a few people in the middle of the night there in places like Australia who have joined us. And I really appreciate that commitment to opening our minds to the possibilities of things. And this idea of an ecological civilization is one that totally inspired me. And really, I'm devoting the next years of my life to getting these ideas out there in the world, because I feel it's so important. So really looking forward to this class today. I'm going to share the screen now. And take you through that first presentation, as Marianne mentioned. And so hopefully at this point, you should be able to see the screen and right here on envisioning an ecological civilization. And let's begin. As Marianne said, we're going to be doing 2 actual talks today. And the first one is going to be looking at the question of, well, what really is an ecological civilization, and really why do we need something like this? And maybe the best place to begin with is why we need something like this. And really, here we are. The Earth Charter Institute seems like the best place to begin is with contemplating the Earth itself, our only home, and the only place that we know of in the universe right now where we know that life exists. And on this beautiful planet, life actually emerged fairly early on, billions of years ago. But it's only been the last 100,000 years or so that one particular species developed the collective power and ability to actually affect the quality of the rest of life, like almost like a geological force in itself. And of course, that's the human species. And so, of course, the fundamental question is, well, how are we doing with that? How have we stewarded this incredible power that we have? And the terrible answer that I'm sure everybody joining us today is only too aware of is we're doing a terrible job. We just look around us right now in the world and we see these harbingers of a daunting future with wildfires out of control, floods out of control, drought, and this terrifying realization that it's just only going to get worse and worse as the decades come. It's beginning to get more understood around the world now that we are really facing a climate emergency, that we're headed towards catastrophic 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warming this century, by the end of the century, if we don't do something about it. And the things that nations are talking about doing would still lead to at least 2 degrees or more, which scientists call a prescription for disaster because of the zone of cascading amplifying feedbacks that we're all aware of. Even the 1.5 degree level, which we're pretty much on the way to surpassing in just the next few years, even that's not considered to be a safe target. But here's the thing, we're all aware of this climate emergency, but even if we were somehow able to find some silver bullet or whatever that kind of fixed the climate itself, the climate is only really a symptom of a deeper underlying trauma, a deeper underlying pathology that we're looking at, which is the vast ecological destruction that our global civilization is causing across the board, across the entire Earth. And just to give you a few highlights, I'm not going to dwell too much on all the details of this, but a few highlights of giving a sense of how extreme this destruction is. There's been a 68% decline in animal populations worldwide since just 1970 alone. We're now looking at the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. Only this one, of course, is caused by one particular species. Where no matter what happens, scientists are pretty much convinced we're looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN forecast that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all the statistics, the one that blows my mind the most is this one, that at the current rates, by 2050, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. And so, yeah, how did we get to this crazy place, we might ask? Well, in my earlier book that I published a few years ago, The Patterning Instinct, I looked at the different ways in which cultures made sense of the universe all the way from earliest hunter-gatherer times to the present day. And I won't go into that much detail in this presentation, but one key learning emerged from that, I think, the crucial distillation, which is simply this realization that culture shapes values. Those values shape history. And by the same token, our values, and we have as a global society today, and what will shape the future. So let's turn to our values. And I always think of this picture as being iconic of our values because they're based on separation. Here's these people all separate from each other, connected with their technology, but not with each other, and even separate from the food they're eating. We're not even going to be thinking about where that food might have come from. And if we drill down like one level deeper, we can get to a sense of what is this modern story of separation, that even though we may not be explicit about day to day, we basically live our lives according to it. And that story says things like nature is a machine. Humans are separate from nature. Humans are separate from each other. The human progress arises from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit, And ultimately, basically, that the purpose of life is to just get wealthy and powerful as a result of all this. Now, this modern story of separation, even though it dominates our world today, it actually emerged hundreds of years ago, basically, in early modern Europe, around the time of the scientific revolution. And a lot of the preconceptions that we have today are based on these ideas that were hundreds of years old that have since been superseded, but still dominate our cultural mindset. So Francis Bacon, the prophet of the scientific age at that time, talked about how it was an exciting time. And he talked about how we could establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe, through developing an understanding of science. And we could render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And the Europeans at that time did a very effective job of using science in that way. But they also applied that not just to nature, but to the rest of the world too. So they saw themselves conquering nature, and they also felt that they had some God-given right to conquer other continents too, which they proceeded to do in the ensuing centuries. And that led to this global history of the last few hundred years of basically extraction and exploitation, which arose from that core worldview of separation that emerged in Europe around that time. And that worldview of separation led to a sense like two different dimensions of a belief in supremacy, a belief in human supremacy, that humans were essentially different from the rest of nature and also essentially better. And they somehow had some intrinsic value that the rest of nature didn't have. And the Europeans also developed this white supremacy, that actually among humans, that white Europeans, and especially if you're Christian, were also essentially different from the rest of other humans and in some ways better. And those two dimensions of supremacy led to seeing both nature as a resource and other people as resources. So when they turned to nature, they just looked at how they could extract from nature. And when they looked at other people, they looked at how they could exploit them to the maximum. And we see this kind of mindset all the way back to when Columbus first arrived in what they thought was the New World. And he met the Arawak indigenous people there, the Taino. And he was amazed by how disingenuous they were. And he wrote in his journal that he sent back to the King and Queen of Spain, he said, of anything they have, if you ask them for it, they never say no. They invite the person to share it and show as much love as if they were giving their hearts. And then just a moment or two later in his journal, he goes, they would make fine servants. Should your majesties command it, all the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile or made slaves on the island. With 50 men, he said, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And this was not just Columbus, of course. He was just speaking for that mindset of the culture that led to these grotesque like experiences over the ensuing centuries, the genocide of indigenous people in North and South America, wiping out about 99% of the population. In just one place alone, the Potosi silver mine in South America, over 8 million deaths happened over the generations of people enslaved and forced to work in those mines until they died. 12 million Africans enslaved and transported to the Americas, where they were forced to work in chattel slavery on the sugar, tobacco, indigo, and cotton plantations. And it wasn't just the so-called New World, but the Europeans extended that extraction and exploitation to essentially the entire world, most of it colonized by them, the rest of it under their sphere of influence. And that is the heritage over those centuries that led to the modern system of global capitalism, which basically just has taken that to this dimension where now, if you look at the world itself, at the economies of the world, 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are not countries, but actually these transnational corporations that are driven by their market needs. And they're driven by the requirement that capitalism puts on them to perpetually grow. And we need to recognize that capitalism itself, the system that dominates the world with these corporations, is based on this requirement of perpetual growth. When companies are valued in the stock market, it's based on what's known as the price to earnings ratio. So we're looking at the earnings that they might have right now, but looking at the ratio of how much more a multiple that will be based on their expected growth rate is how those stock markets work. So what we learn from that is a company might earn a certain amount one particular year, but their value is a multiple of that. And it's based on the presumptions of shareholders that they'll keep growing and growing. So if they reduce their growth rate, that current earnings crashes. And meanwhile, those billionaires who are enjoying all those super luxury yachts, or whatever, are actually enjoying that material wealth based not on what they're earning right now, but expectations for continued growth in the future. That's the requirement. So it's a system designed beautifully to mint billionaires, which has led to the greatest inequality in history, where the wealthiest couple of dozen of those billionaires own as much wealth as half the world population, 4 billion people. And that's what leads to this extractive directive of capitalism, of our current civilization, with these overriding requirements to monetize everything as fast as possible, to turn humans basically into consumer zombies, where we're just manipulated to increase those profits for the companies, and to exploit every available resource on the earth, which I feel is really beautifully put together by this picture by Australian theorist Andrew Gaines, where he shows this machine which sucks up natural resources and global cheap labor, puts out pollution, environmental destruction, and consumer junk, and just moves at a faster and faster rate. And they've done, this system has worked incredibly well for what it's designed to do, leading to this great acceleration, as scientists call it, in the amount of human production and consumption of the earth, which really took off since the end of the Second World War and the development of the modern global system. And with all that destruction that's taken place already, global production is actually projected by mainstream economists to be tripling by 2060. And some techno optimists or whatever look at that and they say, oh, don't worry, there's green growth. We'll decouple through technology the growth in GDP from the resource use. And actually, studies have shown that there's no empirical evidence for that kind of decoupling. When people study the growth in GDP and raw material consumption around the world, it tracks almost like absolutely tightly, step by step, which is why so many scientists are warning with louder and louder voices, we're rapidly heading for a precipice. Johan Rockström and his team of scientists in Europe developed a model. They looked of planetary boundaries, where they identified 9 boundaries which defined humanity's safe operating space on the Earth. The terrifying news is that we've already blown through at least 5 of those boundaries. And so scientists are calling out things like, soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. These are conservative, established scientists. These are people who have studied this and are trying to let the world know there is a very big risk. They say we will end our civilization. And ex-UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called it a global suicide pact. So we can ask ourselves, well, is our civilization headed for collapse? Well, we don't know about that. What we do know is that this century, we are experiencing probably one of the few great transformations in the human experience since humans first evolved on Earth. From nomadic hunter-gatherers to agriculture about 10,000 years ago was one transformation. The scientific revolution, another one a few hundred years ago. We're experiencing that today, but none of us really knows where it's going to go. Yes, it could lead to collapse. It could also lead to what maybe some of the global elite are expecting, which is what you might think of as a techno split, where the elite get to develop their own genetically enhanced, neurally connected ways of exploring what it might mean to be humans, while the rest of humanity basically is left to deal with this collapse. In many ways, this is even more of a morally egregious path than total collapse. But the question is, can we redirect humanity to move towards a period, instead of those horrendous scenarios, one of sustainable flourishing. So that's the question. Can we actually shift towards something fundamentally different, which is what we'll be exploring now, an ecological civilization? But to make that shift basically requires changing what we might think of as the fundamental operating system of our entire society. We have to shift not just a few technical or superficial things. We have to shift the fundamental way in which our entire system works from that extractive, exploitative capitalism to one that's based on an affirmation of life. If we go back to that modern story of separation that we were looking at earlier, that nature is a machine, humans are separate from nature, separate from each other, etc. Well, it turns out those were based on ideas from hundreds of years ago. Modern science has recognized now that every one of those ideas of that modern worldview is actually false. So in my book, The Web of Meaning, I explore this in detail. Right now, I'm just going to touch on a couple of highlights of that, and that lead us to this notion of an ecological civilization. So one thing, for example, we now know for sure that animals and the rest of nature is most definitely not machines. We know that elephants, communicate with each other over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. We know that dolphins and whales talk to each other in local dialects. They call each other by name, and they're even known to gossip about those who are temporarily absent. Wolves show deep family commitment, and the males will help raise the young till they reach maturity. And even going beyond mammals, plants themselves, we now understand, have a networked intelligence, a distributed intelligence with up to 20 different senses. We now know from science that plants act intentionally and purposefully. They learn, they have memories, they communicate with each other, and they'll even allocate resources as a community through what biologist Suzanne Simard, who studied this, calls the wood wide web, the mycorrhizal fungal network underground that the roots connect with. So nature is definitely not a machine, nor is it selfish. When scientists have looked at the evolution of the complexity of life since it first began, there's only been a few major transitions as life evolved to this beautiful, rich abundance we see today. And here's the thing, every one of those major steps in life's evolution came about not through species learning how to outcompete or being more selfish, but actually through increases in cooperation between different species, learning to share their particular specialized skills with others. In fact, life evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And one of the great secrets that life discovered over those billions of years is known in biology as mutually beneficial symbiosis. It's like a harmonic dance that ecosystems perform, where plants take the energy of the sun, photosynthesize, and provide nourishment to the animals. The insect pollinates the plants. Animals transport their seeds and fertilize the soil. The fungus regenerates the waste. And as we just saw earlier, those mycorrhizal networks transport nutrients for the plants throughout the ecosystem. So that's how life actually works in ecosystems. And life developed this mutually beneficial symbiosis in a particular pattern through life, known as fractals, patterns that repeat themselves at different scales, which are everywhere in the natural world, from the tiniest element to the largest. And we see fractals all around us, things like coastlines and leaves and lightning, lungs, and neurons. And scientists now recognize that nature itself is a fractally connected system, where every cell is a fractal part of its organism, which is a fractal part of its species, which is part of the ecosystem, which ultimately is part of the living earth, which is known as the holarchy, but basically where each system contains different whole systems within it. And humans are not separate from that. In fact, humans are part of this fractally connected system. And our human flourishing itself is fractal. where every human mind-body organism is fractally connected with their community, which is a fractal part of the living earth. And far from being more selfish than others or outcompeting others, humans actually evolved to be even more cooperative than other primates that we evolved from. In fact, early hominids, millions of years ago, when they found themselves on the savannah, they were vulnerable to predators. Those communities who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over millions of years, human identity as a species expanded from just identifying with self and kin to include the entire group. And it's that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, that differentiates us from other primates. As a result of that, humans developed what are known by psychologists as moral emotions: compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, or embarrassment. These are things we feel in our guts, and we don't just act morally because we think we should. We do so because it feels right. And early indigenous communities around the world understood that and built their value systems on that basis. In Africa, to this day, there's this profound concept of Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. In North America, the Lakota tribe have this phrase, Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related. And they're referring not just to each other and the humans among them, but all the sentience around them, that they're all part of the same living family. And this was really expressed powerfully by Albert Schweitzer, 20th century humanitarian, who made a statement when saying, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, in his words, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. And that is also the beginning and foundation of an ecological civilization, which would be this transformation in the basis of our global civilization from one that is wealth-based to one that is life-based. It's one that would be a global, cultural, and economic system that would promote sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth. And it's a civilization that would take its principles from those principles of ecology that look at how living systems self-organize. Because ecosystems, when left alone from human activity, can remain resilient for millions of years through all kinds of perturbations because of the principles that they evolved from. So the objective of an ecological civilization, the overriding objective, would be to create the conditions for all humans to flourish as part of a thriving, living Earth. And this vision of an ecological civilization doesn't just belong to a small group of people. It wasn't just something that some group somewhere came up with. It's actually an emerging vision from diverse sources all around the world. From indigenous sources, we see concepts like buen vivir, sumac kosai, or Ubuntu. From permaculture principles, we see that from communities like transition towns, the theory of the commons, the degrowth movement, agroecology. We see spiritual traditions like deep ecology, engaged Buddhism, and traditional Chinese principles. And we see all these different political movements, whether it's ecological economics, the anti-globalization movement, racial justice, LGBTQ rights. All these are moving together in the same direction towards this ecological civilization vision. And for all their diversity, all these different groups, ultimately, they share the same story, that we are all interconnected in the web of life. So let's turn now, as I move towards the closing this first presentation, to the core principles of an ecological civilization. And we're going to look at these principles, each of them emerging from what leads ecosystems themselves to be healthy over millions of years, and begin to just touch into how that might relate to human society. So for example, that notion of mutually beneficial symbiosis, where each party gains from a reciprocal relationship. That translates for human society into concepts like fairness, justice, equity, and leading to this foundational concept of individual dignity for every person in the society. That notion of holarchy that we looked at, where each different part of a system is part of the greater whole, leads to this recognition that the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part. And the term for that I use in the book, and we'll come back to, the term for that is fractal flourishing. Then there's the principle of diversity, the recognition that a system's health depends on both differentiation and integration, that an ecosystem has all these multiple different species, all different from each other, but they're also integrated in what they do as part of a bigger system. And in human society, what that really relates to is this recognition of the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Then ecosystems enjoy balance, where every part of that system has evolved to be in a harmonious relationship with the entire system. If we apply that to our global system now, that would lead to things like a steady state economy with equitable distribution of wealth and power. Now, if you look at an ecosystem, we know that each different species within that system does what it does, not because there's some big power that's telling it what to do, but because it's following its own directive as part of this bigger system of all of life, which leads to this notion of what is known as subsidiarity, which means basically grassroots self-autonomy, pushing decision-making in whatever elements of society down to the lowest possible level in the system. And then, of course, there's this recognition of embeddedness, recognizing humanity as being not separate from, but part of the natural world, leading to this sense of tending Mother Earth, rather than trying to dominate or control her or extract resources from her, but recognizing that is what we humans are here on the earth to do. And then finally, there's this principle of regeneration, basically this sense of sustainable flourishing into the long-term future, which was probably best expressed by this part of the constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy in North America here, which goes like this: in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So these are some of the core principles of an ecological civilization. I'm going to take a pause right now. We're going to have a few minutes of a Q&A in the plenary and then go into breakout groups. And just to give you a sense of where we're going from this, as we go into the second hour of this masterclass, we're going to be looking at what those principles actually would mean in practice, so we can really get a tangible sense of what an ecological civilization would actually feel like and what actually be like. And we're going to end my presentation, my second one, with looking at this equally practical question of, well, that being the case, how do we get to there where we are now? So that's where we're going to be headed. I'm going to leave you with these 2 questions that after we've done a little bit of a Q&A, we'll be able to explore in breakout rooms together. And the questions are this: what does an ecological civilization mean to you? Like, what does this idea inspire in your imagination? So I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now, and we'll come back to our main room here. And well, we have maybe, I'd say maybe 10 minutes or so for any questions that people want to share right now. And just know that after the second presentation, we'll have a longer period of time for general discussion where, and so we'll be able to go a little bit more deeply into questions that arise from both of these presentations. But right now, if there's any particular questions around that first presentation for clarification or whatever, I invite you to share the next few minutes.
Jeremy, thank you so much. It's good to hear you in such an insightful and with such a good energy.
Mm.
I actually want to invite everyone to take a few seconds to reflect on what you just heard, on key things that stands out to you. You can even write down for yourself, or if you want, you can also write down takeaways in the chat box, because there was so much information you just shared, right? So there were keywords, no? Worldviews of separation. Is our civilization heading towards a collapse? How can our civilization head towards a more flourishing and ecological civilization?
Mm.
Can I ask you to come back to the key principles you mentioned? Because I only could, what stand out to me was humanity, embeddedness, and regeneration. But can you just come back and give us like what are these principles that you are talking about? Can you repeat them just quickly?
Oh, sure. Hold on one second while I look at that. Basically, the key principles, and of course, these are just ones that I've tried to distill from my own understanding. They're not set in stone, and other people might come up with principles that are a little bit different. So I don't want to give some sense of orthodoxy here. But what I saw as these key principles are symbiosis, holarchy, that sense of everything being fractally connected, diversity, balance, embeddedness, that's embeddedness of humanity within the rest of nature, subsidiarity, that's pushing those decision-making down to the lowest level in the system, and regeneration. So those are the key principles, and I'll happily share that maybe in the chat a little bit later. And I do
so
see
you are seeing these principles as key principles to help guide humanity towards a more ecological civilization.
Yeah, basically what I see about these principles is that they are fundamental principles that biologists have discovered ecosystems have evolved with over these billions of years to build this richness of life. And part of the understanding of an ecological civilization is we can actually, if we can consciously rebuild our civilization, we can build it on the same principles, but then apply them in certain ways to human society. Because we are different from the rest of life. It doesn't mean that we have to model ourselves exactly according to ecosystems. Taking those principles, we can then apply them to how our society works. And that's what we'll see in that second presentation. But I do see, a question
go ahead.
Irma Verhoeven, which I think is really a key one. So I just wanted to touch on that if we could for a minute, and then come back to another one. And I see Irma says, what made humans selfish as we are part of nature? And she writes the selfish in quotes there. What made humans, quote, selfish as we are part of nature and nature is not selfish? Well, just to clarify, because these are complex issues, and I really go into this in a lot more detail in this book, The Web of Meaning. But what we need to understand about nature is not so much that nature is not selfish, but that basically nature has evolved to balance a certain level of selfishness. I don't even like that word because it has this moral human connotation of that selfishness is bad, but basically a drive towards the autonomous entity flourishing for its own, and it will eat or compete with other entities out there in order for itself to flourish. So we can call that selfish if we want, but again, that's a human moral term. But so nature combines that with this drive for entities to work out how to cooperate with other entities around them. And in the book, as I describe this, I think the best way, and this is what systems biologists often come to, is to recognize that what we see in nature is not essentially selfishness or cooperation. It's not like it's one or the other, but it's more like harmony. So in one of those slides, I called it the harmonic dance of life, that we can recognize harmony in an ecosystem as being this blending of that drive for competition or like outcompeting along with cooperation. But what is true, as I said, is that the great steps of evolution towards greater and greater abundance, the richness of life that we've seen now on life, all arose from cooperation. So even if nature is both cooperative and competitive, it's cooperation that has led to the abundance and complexity of life on Earth today. So hopefully that's a little bit more of a clarification.
So Marian, if you don't mind, so thank you, Jeremy, for explaining that. And I agree, selfish is I don't like that word either. So how come, as we've been part of nature, I mean, we've been here not very long time compared to many other organisms.
Right.
What is the cause? What made us lose that balance from, me as an autonomous species, needing other species to thrive?
Yes.
What went wrong?
Yes, great question. And again, I cover this in some depth in that book, The Web of Meaning, as well as actually in my earlier book, The Patterning Instinct. But basically what we need to recognize, if we look at our primate ancestors that humans and other modern primates all descended from about 8 to 10 million years ago or more, those primates were very much they were very much based on alpha male selfishness. Basically, those systems were the alpha male was the one who was the most powerful, and there was this drive for each male to be the dominant of that particular group. We see that to some degree in other primate species now. In chimpanzees or gorillas or orangutans, they're very much based on that alpha male social hierarchical system. What made humans different is that, as I said, they diverged and they developed this like deep sense of moral emotions to identify as a group. But even though we evolved in that way, there's still a more sort of archetypal element within the human evolved way of being, particularly in males, to want to sort of still want to be the dominant alpha male. In earlier nomadic hunter-gatherer times, the millions of years in which humans actually evolved to be humans, what is fascinating, and basically there's an author, Christopher Boehm, B-O-E-H-M, who's written 2 wonderful books that really explains this incredibly well. He's both a primatologist and an anthropologist, and he's in this great position to recognize how this evolution happened. But there was like this kind of balance between these 2 forces. And nomadic hunter-gatherers developed social technologies to keep down those alpha males, to keep them in check. So if one got a bit too big for his britches, people might gossip about him or like make fun of him and bring him down. And if necessary, they'd even group together and actually work against this person to keep things more stable. So there was a little bit of an uneasy balance, but the group identity was more powerful. When we settled down in sedentism with agriculture, that earlier primate sort of drive for male dominance became, it got to be more entrenched, and there was a ratchet effect where those who developed like more wealth put up fences around their fields, and then they could employ other people, and they got to the lucky ones got to be the big sort of chief of the different area. And then the particular group where they were more aggressive got to conquer then the other place next to them or whatever. So this ratchet effect happened over in early sedentism, and then moving more extreme with early civilizations, and then to the modern times we see. So what we, and we need to recognize this. There's not an inevitability to that, but that is the way that we've seen human history actually evolve. So a lot of what we need to do is look back at those earlier principles from indigenous traditions and learn about how we can apply those same principles to the world today in a way that actually can reduce that power imbalance that's developed.
We have many good comments and questions. I just try to read maybe 4 or 5 of them, and given the time, Jeremy.
Yes, because I'd like to try and make sure we have 10 minutes for that breakout.
Correct. So let me read 4 or 5 questions. You pick the ones that you want for now, just to answer maybe 2 quickly, and then we go to breakout room, and then you can take time to read all these questions and come back when we are in the plenary. So Ernest asked, what does tending Mother Earth mean and how it differentiates from Earth stewardship? Ruben asked, what will motivate the shift to an ecological civilization? Nicola asked, what do you think is the significance of language informing, revealing, rewriting the damaging stories we currently live by? Well, the last one, maybe, Michelle, what are the most promising ways to get people back in touch with these deep values and recognition of those basic principles? So,
yes, well, thank you for all of these. And a lot of these, I think, will be somewhat touched on in the next presentation I give, where we'll be looking both at how these principles can be applied to our civilization, and then to this question of how do we make the change happen. So I'd love to focus on some of these themes in the last 20 minutes or half hour of our masterclass today. One thing though, just to touch on one of the things that got mentioned right now, this question about tending Mother Nature and what does it mean and how does that relate to the notion of stewardship or whatever. This again is something I talk about in some detail in the book, The Web of Meaning, but there's this fascinating recognition that actually oftentimes we think of there's 2 ways of relating of humans to relate to the living earth. One is a little bit like the ways that early indigenous people lived to it, like in traditional Chinese thought, that this notion of wu wei, of kind of not forcing nature, but just kind of going with the flow. And then there's the notion of agriculture, which is sort of like putting the fences up and sowing seeds and all that work, which leading to technology and civilization. But what has been discovered, and what people like Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about really well in Braiding Sweetgrass, and a anthropologist, Kat Anderson, who studied indigenous peoples in California, has written a book called Tending the Wild, is that many indigenous people have discovered a different way over those millennia of relating to nature, where more of like a symbiotic way, where they've developed practices that actually don't force down things on nature, but actually lead to natural species around them thriving while producing what is beneficial for humans in that species. That I see as one of the great challenges for our modern society and for technology moving forward, to shift the very basis, to look at how can we develop global technologies to actually be symbiotic, that actually work for the benefit of life on Earth while they work for our benefit. So that just is like a framing shift that's available to us. But I see now it's around 10 to the hour. So if we can go back to those 2 questions, maybe put them again in the chat so people see them right there. I'll ask each, maybe if we can go to breakout groups of 3 people to spend a few minutes to share with the other people in the group, what does an ecological civilization mean to you? What does this idea inspire in your imagination? And just wanted to let you know, I will kind of join in like a fly on the wall in 1 or 2 of these conversations, just because I love to just feel into the energy that's going around. So if you do see me suddenly join your room, no need to even talk to me. Just give a quick wave, and I'll just be there silently for a minute or two, and then disappear and go somewhere else. So just to help me to feel into the great intelligence collectively that's there in the space. So why don't we actually shoot for maybe 8 minutes, then Marianne giving us getting back on the hour.
So everybody's invited to click and join your group, and then we'll come back. Well, these conversations are always very exciting.
Yes.
Hope everybody felt as I did. So Jeremy, thank you everybody. I was also part of a group and felt very energized.
Yes. Yeah,
Jeremy,
I want to say I was just inspired and energized by each of the different parts I heard from the different conversations I hovered into. So thank you so much, everyone who shared stuff as I was there. So let me go directly into this next presentation to make sure we give as much time as possible for a full-on discussion as a group at the end. So I'm going to share the screen again right now. And hopefully you should all be seeing something that says Part 2, an ecological civilization in practice. So, well, to begin with, we can start really from those principles that we ended up with at the end of that last presentation, these principles that ecosystems themselves have relied on for flourishing over millions of years. And there's a lot to hold, these kind of 7 principles, but we kind of distill that in a way into 3 more foundational ones that you can keep with you as we're looking at these applications for human society. Basically, is this principle of integration, of like unity, being part of a unified whole with diversity, the principle of mutually beneficial symbiosis that we talked about, and that principle of fractal flourishing. And in the first part of this presentation, we're going to look at how these principles apply in practice all across. We're not just talking, when we're talking about ecological civilization, we're not just talking about changing our economy, but every aspect, like distribution of wealth, technology and infrastructure, governance, culture, and how we relate to the living earth. And we can begin maybe by drilling down one level more on that principle of fractal flourishing I mentioned. Basically, what that means is at the individual level, meaning setting the conditions for true individual dignity with adequate housing for all, competent healthcare, quality education, safety and security. It means that the next fractal layer of the society, the societal health requires things like reduced inequality, integrated communities, respect for diversity, and restorative justice for those who have been so oppressed, as we were exploring in that last, in the first presentation. And then, or the greater context of Earth, a flourishing Earth with abundant wildlife, elimination of pollutants, regenerative practices. So now let's begin looking at some of the economic elements of what an ecological civilization might mean. Well, it would require a drastic reduction in this extreme global income inequality, with a just transition from the fossil fuel economy and things like a global wealth tax, a universal basic income, and property return to the commons. And we'll look at a couple of these in a little more detail, beginning with this notion of the commons. The commons we can understand basically as referring to any source of sustenance and well-being that hasn't yet been appropriated, either by the state or by private ownership. So the commons refers to everything from all the contributions nature gives to our well-being, like the atmosphere, fresh water, sunshine, soil, the oceans, and all the contributions that our human heritage has given us over hundreds of thousands of years, like language, cultural traditions, technical know-how, and then more recently, scientific knowledge. And sort of to understand the commons, we can kind of look at that historically and build up the sense of the great wealth available to all of us, starting from over the lifetime of the earth, the things like the atmosphere, water, and sunshine. And then with the evolution of humans, things like language, cultural traditions, and technology. Then with the rise of civilizations over the last couple of thousand years, things like writing, law, civilization itself, and specialized knowledge, in the last few centuries, benefits like electricity, industrialization, and global markets. In just the last few decades, the amazing benefits, things like microprocessors, computer code, and the internet. And when we recognize all this is available to our total human collective, then we see that you get something like a company that took all that global commons and did a few tweaks to it. And let's call it, like, say, Facebook as an example. What we then realize is that Facebook or any of these other companies merely added a few little incremental tweaks to this incredible treasure trove of global commons. But meanwhile, in our society, that allows somebody like Mark Zuckerberg to have a net worth of like $75 billion. Well, 4 billion other human beings on this earth earn less than $7.40 a day, the minimum income people need for basic nutrition and a normal life expectancy. We have to ask, is that not like one of the greatest moral egregiousnesses in all of history? And so fundamental to an ecological civilization would be something that capped those billionaires' wealth and transferred that money to all of us, because the wealth really is not in what that one person did, but in the commons. So we can look at that notion of the commons as really being like the commonwealth. We can kind of retake that word and apply that to the wealth available to all human beings. And that wealth can be distributed to all human beings using basically something that has already been tried and tested around the world, this notion of a universal basic income, which is the concept of giving an income to every person alive on this earth, sufficient to actually give them the basics they need for that dignity, the adequate housing, the adequate food, etc. It's based on this idea that everyone alive has a moral right to share in that commonwealth. And it's recognizing that rather than, from our dominant worldview, people think, oh, you can't do that. People are just lazy. They'll just squander the money. And they'll, actually the opposite is true. Purposeful work is an integral part of human flourishing. And people have a fundamental need to feel valued by community. And in these places around the world where these UBI pilot programs have been tried, these programs consistently report when this universal basic income is given, no questions asked, to a group of people, a reduction in crime, child mortality, malnutrition, truancy, teenage pregnancy, alcohol consumption, and an increase in things like health, gender equality, school performance, and entrepreneurial activity. So that's one fun big piece of that. Now let's turn our attention to those corporations that we were looking at earlier, kind of devouring the world. In an ecological civilization, they would exist for humanity rather than for shareholder returns. Some of you may be familiar with concepts already there in the world today, like benefit corporations and B Corp certifications, where corporations can choose to change their articles of incorporation. So they legally have to consider the impact of their decisions on workers, customers, suppliers, community, environment. A few enlightened companies have made that choice, but there's only been a few thousand worldwide. And of course, it's had virtually zero impact on our society as a whole because it's voluntary, and the big corporations wouldn't dream of doing that. So in an ecological civilization, the triple bottom line of not just profit, but also people and planet, like we see in those B Corps, would be required for corporate charters. This would fundamentally reorganize these transnational corporations. They could only have their charters renewed every few years, and the discretion of community-based panels chosen by sortition to reduce the risk of corruption that would evaluate whether they actually met each of those three bottom lines. And corporations would be subject, just like right now they worry about financial bankruptcy, they'd be subject to social or environmental bankruptcy if they failed to meet all of those. So it would be something that would be fully enforced, and that would change the intrinsic character of the corporation. So imagine, for example, there's some copper mine somewhere that a company has the potential to exploit. Right now, the current situation is these company executives and board are driven, they have to maximize shareholder value. So of course they're going to choose to exploit it to the extent they can. If they didn't, their share price would decline. They'd be at risk of being sued by shareholders. And meanwhile, that mine, even no matter how polluting it is, would be acquired by a more ruthless competitor. So they say, well, got no choice. Under a triple bottom line requirement, we'd see balanced decision-making, where those risks of pollution, the needs of community would be applied to all the other factors. And just like we do as regular human beings when we make a decision, they'd optimize all three bottom lines rather than just that shareholder profit. Meanwhile, a lot of focus would move from corporations themselves to worker-owned co-ops, which are designed to, based on these principles like equity and fairness, solidarity, social responsibility, dignity, and respect. And they generally have a much fairer pay ratio between executives and workers, with primacy given to the welfare of employees, customers, and community, and more of a long-term orientation than short-term profit. And cooperatives can scale successfully in every way just as much as these transnational corporations. A great example is the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, founded by a Catholic priest in Basque Country in the 1950s. It now has over 80,000 employees, over 250 companies in areas ranging from finance to consumer goods, capital equipment, retail. And still in these companies, the CEO receives no more than 6 times the salary of the lowest paid worker. In the economy as a whole, we'd move toward a circular economy, which increases employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourced from recycled materials, with waste virtually eliminated. And crucially, there would be full cost pricing required for all goods, which basically means that the pricing in each good would incorporate the full ecological cost in a product's complete life cycle. So it would internalize these costs that right now are externalized, with the result that something like that plastic bag that right now is dirt cheap would become super expensive. Something like that jute bag would actually be cheaper because it doesn't have all of those externalized costs. When we look at cities, they would be designed on ecological principles, with community gardens on every block, with extensive use of energy efficient designs, rooftop gardens, aquaponics. Cars would be banned from the city centers, and essential services would always be within a 20-minute walk, encouraging that community interaction. Outside of the cities, in the countryside, agroecology would replace global industrial monocrops based on principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture, leading to greater crop biodiversity, greater water and carbon efficiency, virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer, and in time, the elimination of factory farming. And studies have shown that agroecology, based on these principles, can be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without all the devastating effects that it causes. Then we can move to how technology might look. Basically, right now, when we look at how our technology works that so dominates our lives today, it's based on centralized control. Well, those companies like Facebook or Uber or Google or Amazon or Airbnb, no matter what they are, even though they sometimes talk about putting the giving more agency to people, actually they control all the information. But using modern blockchain technology and what's known as the distributed ledger, technology can be redesigned so the control is decentralized, where each party holds their agency over what they do with the data. This kind of distributed ledger can empower and protect collective action, enable people to cooperate and coordinate at large scale. And in modern, people are looking increasingly about how this can be applied to things like property law, money systems, enterprise structures. There's this notion of a distributed autonomous organization, where organizations themselves can be owned by the usage rather than who has the wealth, information ownership, and even reformulating how democracy itself can work. Then looking at just our political structures, rather than necessarily looking at these state lines and country lines, which essentially were just based on past political history of conquest, we'd be looking at society organized based on bioregions. This is a map of what California, for example, might look like if we're actually organized as separate societies based on bioregions, because regions have different needs and affinities based on their ecological context. It would mean that communities could connect more with their land rather than these global flows from globalization. And it would emphasize local production, leading to local consumption to the greatest extent possible. The way we would measure the success of our entire society would be very different. Rather than GDP or gross domestic product, which basically just measures the rate at which these corporations are extracting and monetizing essentially the living earth and monetizing human activity. We'd be looking at indicators such as the genuine progress indicator, which is one that's actually used right now, which factors in negatives like income inequality, environmental pollution and crime, and factors in positives like volunteer work, household work, or education. That's just one of a number of different types of measures that are being explored around the world to look at true well-being. On the global level, we'd be looking at a far more muscular United Nations with enforcement powers over that global commons, the oceans, atmosphere, ecosystems, fresh water. We'd be seeing at the UN the declaration of a rights of nature that would put the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity. And we'd be looking at personhood being given, as is happening in a few cases now, to ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals. And ecocide, the destruction of whole ecosystems, would be defined as an international crime. Then just shifting our attention to the sense of our culture and community. Right now, most of our cultural systems are designed based on what the fabulous writer Riane Eisler calls domination systems, which basically are the authoritarian and hierarchical social and economic structures that we see around us, with a high degree of abuse and violence. Basically, the patriarchy we see around us, which subordinates women and quote unquote femininity to males and masculinity. And it propagates beliefs and stories that justify and idealize that domination and violence. And as Riane Eisler has shown really powerfully, what we can shift to in an ecological civilization is more of a partnership system with more equitable structures, socially equal valuing of males and females, mutual respect and trust with a low degree of violence, and beliefs and stories that give value to empathic and caring relations. And of course, part of that begins with education, which would also be re-envisioned. Like right now, our mainstream education, the objective of it is to prepare students to be good corporate citizens in the corporate marketplace, get them to base their lives on values like selfishness, individualism, nationalism. And of course, that maintains the system of divisiveness, exploitation, and extraction. So we'd be looking at reformulating education to be life-affirming, preparing students to pursue well-being and that fractal flourishing, to live according to values of cooperation, collaboration, imagination, creativity, community orientation, and basically moving towards that partnership society we just looked at. Fundamentally, what we would be looking at is a transformation in values, one with an emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions, prioritizing progress in that quality, not the quantity of stuff, basing our political, social, and economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity, emphasizing justice and dignity for all, and building our civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world would be a foundational principle. As I said in that earlier presentation, culture shapes values, values shape history, and it's our values that will shape the future, which probably has led many of you now to be asking, well, Okay, that looks great, but how will those values shape the future? How can we actually get there? We're so far from there right now. So let's take a look in these last few minutes about how change actually happens. The most important thing to understand is that it follows a non-linear path. And when social scientists look at change, they show that if you look at sort of the amounts of public support new ideas have over time, that begins with sometimes a very long and slow early adoption phase, where you deal with what people call ideological lock-in, where people are stuck with their received attitudes and opinions even when they become outdated. There's social rigidity, there's political inertia. And the main thing those people who are the early adopters hear around them is, it'll never happen. But then at a certain point, there's a tipping point occurs. And when that tipping point happens, you begin to experience a crescendo of change where influential thought leaders attract increasing numbers of people. There's a natural herd instinct that we have as humans because of our shared sense of community, but that shifts the direction towards the new thinking. And the stickiness of the old thinking gets to be superseded by the pull of the new idea, leading ultimately to widespread adoption, where those new ways of thinking have become institutionalized. There's still some diehard reactionaries, but now they're in the minority. And then the thing that you generally hear around you is, oh, it was inevitable. It had to happen. So what are some examples of that? Well, we can look at the inspiring example, for example, of women's suffrage. It wasn't much more than a century ago when women anywhere in the world had no ability to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst founded the National Union for Women's Suffrage in England in 1897. It took her 10 years just to muster up a few thousand people to go on a march in London for the women's right to vote in 1907. And just a couple of decades later, women were getting the right to vote in the UK and the US, followed by other countries all around the world. We see that in the civil rights movement in the United States in 1955. Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted over a year. Black churches were burned. Black citizens were arrested. It seemed to many people like a hopeless cause at the time. And less than 10 years later, there was the March on Washington, 1963, with over 200,000 people, that famous speech from Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. And the Civil Rights Act was passed the next year into law by President Johnson. And we see similar kinds of nonlinear shifts even in more recent times, such as like the Me Too movement. Actually, that phrase Me Too was first used by civil rights activist Tarana Burke in just 2006 to raise awareness of sexual assault. It never occurred to her that roughly 10 years later, that hashtag Me Too would go viral. That Harvey Weinstein, presumed to be, one of these people who were untouchable, arrested for sexual assault. And that hashtag would potentiate this movement. It still has a long way to go, but potentiate that movement to transform abusive cultural norms around the world. But maybe the most valuable case study to look at is the rise of neoliberalism itself. And this is worth taking a closer look at. Back in 1947, there was this society founded by one of the founders of neoliberal thought, Friedrich Hayek, called the Mont Pelerin Society. And he saw this great danger in what was occurring at the time after the war of the expansion of government. So the declared objective of this Mont Pelerin Society was things like preserving and reaffirming private property rights, a moral code for public and private activity, and limiting state actions by the rule of law, and in their words, the right of each individual to plan his own life. And this was considered way outside of normal political discourse at the time. But over a few years, Hayek and the people who founded this society attracted so-called free market, like economists, business leaders, and journalists. You'll see there's names on this screen. You probably recognize some of them. And these institutions like the Cato Institute and Heritage Foundation that have become so influential in the world around us. And by the time Ronald Reagan was doing his campaign in 1980, there's an amazing statistic of the 76 economic advisors on his staff, 22 of them were members of the Mont Pelerin Society. And with that kind of influence that they inculcated around the world, the result was the neoliberal world order, with the election of people like Reagan and Thatcher in that period. And so some of these statements that became sort of resonated around the world, that have led to the foundation of the modern dominant ideology, like Reagan, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem, or this idea of trickle-down economics, or Margaret Thatcher's notion that there is no alternative, in her words, to this market liberal state, or that there's no such thing as society, she even said, people must look after themselves first. All of these came from this thinking that got sort of seeded by that Mont Pelerin Society a couple of decades earlier. And that led to this incredible success for them in terms of these results, where the elite have now managed to grow their wealth massively, even while the bottom 90% of people's wealth has declined since that time when Reagan and Thatcher were elected, right around 1980. And that elite wealth, measured by that GDP, has come at the expense of welfare and happiness of the public as a whole. You remember that measurement of GPI, Genuine Prosperity Index, that actually peaked at 1978, right when neoliberalism took over, and has declined ever since. And this is an interesting conclusion by a neoliberal reviewer of a history of the Mont Pelerin Society. And in his words, when he looks at this, he says, thought precedes action. Think tanks and ideas indeed have consequences. Ideas, good or bad, triumph in the end. Good or bad, triumph in the end. And when we look at that neoliberal paradigm shift, we see what it basically was about is they took all of these different elements like regulatory controls or eliminate taxes, demolish organized labor. These are all separate ideas and tactics, but they were all under the umbrella of this concept of the freedom of the individual. We can think of that as like a shared network of meanings, that all the people around the world working on these different elements all recognized they shared the same umbrella of where they were moving to. And what they accomplished was shifting what's known as the Overton window. Now, Overton was the name of one of those neoliberal theorists around that time. And he coined the term to talk about the range of policies that are politically acceptable to mainstream discourse at a particular time. So that's the Overton window. And what is not in the window is unthinkable for most people in the society. And if you look at where neoliberalism was at when Hayek first founded that Mont Pelerin Society, it was outside of the window of acceptable discourse. It wasn't beyond radical. It wasn't even thinkable. But what the Mont Pelerin Society did over the decades was help move it from unthinkable to mainstream policy. They shifted the window. So they didn't shift their ideas. They shifted the window of discourse until they became mainstream. So now if we look at the ecological civilization paradigm shift we need, we can look at these different things we've just been talking about, revoking corporate powers, agroecology, grassroots democracy, circular economy. But we need to recognize that all of these have to be part. Remember that notion of integration, unity with differentiation. All these parts have to be part of the shared network of meaning to move toward a life-affirming civilization. So the challenge for those of us who want to see that shift is basically over the decades to come, reversing that Overton window and moving it so that neoliberalism becomes unthinkable. Growth-based capitalism itself becomes a radical idea, and we move closer and closer towards the potential for a true ecological civilization. And the way in which that can happen, again, maybe one of the great scions of neoliberalism, he kind of described it better than anyone. He's Milton Friedman. He talked about how only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. In his words, that I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And of course, right now, we're experiencing a meta crisis in the world. And these are just some of the great trailblazers moving us towards this potential for an ecological civilization, to that place where we can shift that Overton window. So what we have to realize that right now, our current civilization is unraveling. And as it unravels from its inherent contradictions, the potential increases for it to be rewoven with the best ideas that are lying around. That the real challenge for us is to reweave the current civilization, to transform it from within without it first collapsing, causing devastation for basically all of us. So that's our challenge. So then when we look at this potential for ecological civilization itself to experience that tipping point, well, one thing that is both terrifying but also actually allows for the possibility of this shift is the magnitude of the crisis we're facing: the climate emergency, the global inequality, the environmental collapse, the breakdown of political norms. And the rise of the internet, even though we're very aware of the damaging effect it has with its siloization, it also has led to the increased transmittal speed of new ideas and an emergent global sense of a shared humanity. So this shift towards an ecological civilization, and if it were to occur, it would be a major shift. And of course, the challenge we have is we only have a few decades to do it at most. And we have to make that shift intentionally. We have to consciously change our own values and behavior and those of people around us. But if we were to make that happen, it would be one of these great transitions in human history, such at the depth and profundity of like the ones that moved from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, or from agriculture to the scientific revolution. And I noticed somebody put this point in the chat, that we'd actually be moving essentially from what we all recognize right now as the Anthropocene to a different era for humanity, which has been called by Glenn Albrecht, the Symbiocene. So the Anthropocene, as many of us know, defines the modern era that shifted from the Holocene. And it's based on this ideology of human supremacy when human impact reaches geological proportions. It's destructive of life and biodiversity, and it's inherently unstable. And with the vision of the Symbiocene, which would be the period that would usher in that ecological civilization, would be based on the principle of that symbiosis, of the mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and the living earth, where we'd use technology for those regenerative, life-affirming practices. And that period could potentially be very long-lived on the earth. Basically, we humans could become like a civilization learning how to tend Mother Earth. The magnitude of this change is a daunting proposition, but I do want to leave with you those powerful words that some of you may know from Margaret Mead. And she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So thank you for that. And now I'll come out of screen share and look forward to engaging in conversation. We already had some wonderful questions from earlier, and I'm sure there are more now. And maybe I'll turn to you, Marianne, as to how you want to facilitate some of this, some of our conversation now.
So thank you very much, Jeremy. We had, again, very inspiring, thought-provoking views of this, how we can envision the ecological civilization and steps, clues to get us there. There are many comments and questions. I'm just going to bring a few, and then when we go into quick breakout room, you can take a closer look into that. But several people commented on how much they like the idea of a bioregional framework. So Christopher and several others said, "Oh, that's a really nice idea." Christopher, also, so you may want to comment on how to really make that happen with bioregional idea or framework. But Christopher also asked, so what is our new touchstone by which we can navigate towards or toward the future? Dirk said, thank you for your masterclass. I agree with everything you said, but change needs to be radical and fast. Can you share your thoughts on how can we speed up this transition that have been presented and discussed here?
Yes.
And then you can comment quickly on that. We go to a quick breakout room and we come back to the last session of Q&As.
Oh, I see. I didn't know we were going to have another breakout room. I thought we were going to just stay, because we only have 20 minutes, just stay in the general plenary.
Yeah.
Right.
As you wish.
I would like that. I don't want to go off to a small group.
Yeah, because I think,
Okay.
yeah, if that's okay. So let's talk about first this question of bioregionalism, and I'd like to expand it to a even bigger sort of context, and then this notion about how change can occur. And I'd also encourage people to raise your hand with a hand raising function and actually share your voice to the discussion, so we can get other voices in this conversation too. So please, I encourage you to do that. So in terms of bioregionalism, and I do want to point out, Larry Green is in the room here today, and he's somebody in the Pacific Northwest who's actually doing some amazing work on actually getting a sense of a shift towards bioregionalism in that area. And others, if there's others in the group here today who are working on bioregionalism in your area, put that in the chat so other people can connect with you in terms of what you're doing. So I think that what we have to really look at is primarily on reducing the power of the nation state as part of that. Right now, it's unthinkable that part of that outside the Overton windows, the very notion that we can organize our world in anything other than nation states, they were based on that same premise of exploitation and extraction. The nation states all around the world, from Europe to Africa to North and South America, less so in Southeast Asia, but even there too, were essentially results of imperialism, of people, of those sort of white male European rulers carving up the world. We don't need to be stuck with that. It's a radical change to look at these possibilities, but part of what an ecological civilization would be about is looking at that. And the some of you may know the great theorist of the commons, Elinor Ostrom, who writes about there are basic principles by which commons, small groups of people working together with a shared resource, manage themselves, which are based very similar to the same principles that hunter-gatherer indigenous groups used. Not surprisingly, because we're human beings. These are the evolved principles by which humans work well together. Well, she also came up with this notion of polycentric commons, basically the idea that these can be applied at different layers of scale. So a commons can exist within a small group of people working in enterprise. It can exist in a community. It can exist up to a bioregion. And then from the bioregion, it can exist to like a larger, maybe continental region, and ultimately to a global region. So in an ecological civilization, we'd have to be looking at certain decisions that affect the entire globe have to be made at those levels, but they don't need to be done by having nation states that are, for the most part, even when they pretend to be democracies, undemocratically, corruptly elected, sending their corrupt leaders to negotiate decisions together. But it would be based on these commons-based elements where certain levels of power at appropriate times were pushed up to the next level and until you got to the global. So I think one of the ways we can actually see that shift is through the more empowerment of cities, basically. And cities need to relate very strongly to their own bioregions. So we'd be looking at a rethinking of how the world works. And it may not happen overnight, but basically anything that pushes power down to those grassroots autonomous levels, and anything that to the other degree pushes power away from nation states, but more towards that global level, actually helps us to move towards an ecological civilization. So that's one concept. There's a very super important, and Hugh, I'll get to you in a moment after I've answered that second question that Marianne asked. And then any other people who want to put their hands up. And I would encourage, oftentimes we're still living in the legacy of the patriarchy, where oftentimes, even in more enlightened groups, men often feel that they have the privilege to speak more than women do. So I encourage those who identify as women to just know that the invitation is there for you to put your hand up and share in this public conversation together. But the question about changing at the dramatic speed that we need is obviously crucial. And I think to one degree, one thing we need to realize is, just like Milton Friedman said in that last quote, so most of this change in speed is not really up to any of us. The society itself is already unraveling. What is really needed is for us to shift people's attention to looking at the underlying reasons why things are unraveling and realizing that they have agency to do something about that. The inertia we're stuck with right now is a lot to do with the fact that the corporate media is owned by those same powers that are part of our capitalist domination system. And those powers want to shift people's attention to looking at the local celebrity type thing, or even when there are progressive movements coming up with new ideas, they'll shift the debate about it to talk about PC or come up with these notions that they undermine the very strength and power of the ideas around. So I think what's crucially important is those of us who want to move towards a life-affirming civilization is to avoid getting caught into the entrenchment of separations between where we want to go and what we see as reactionary forces doing. We're not going to get there by basically seeing those people who are slowing the progress as being the enemy or as being the other. It's by reaching into their hearts. It's by getting people all around the world to recognize that they are living human beings who want to actually live according to those values of love and harmony, and actually want to feel a sense of community and want to live on a living earth that's flourishing. Getting them to be pulled towards the positive is, I think, one of the things that we need to do, and not being afraid to put ourselves out there in the streets. People I think things like the Extinction Rebellion movements that are effective in some parts of the world. Things like the supporting the Greta Thunberg inspired school children movement, letting young people know they have agency, putting our support behind their sense of fear and giving them the recognition that something positive they can move towards is crucial. When we saw that last sort of upsurge in grassroots global activity with the Occupy movement, and then we saw it fizzle out, a lot of the critique about it was that they knew what they were against, but they didn't know what they were for. What we have the opportunity, many of us in this group today, part of that more senior generations, what we owe to the younger generations is to give them a sense that there are alternatives, that actually there is something that's possible, which is why I love this term ecological civilization, because it's one term that everyone can share. It doesn't belong to any one group. It belongs to all of us. So let me move to you, Hugh, for your a question and invite others to join in.
Wow. The scale of what you're outlining is overwhelming, but let me, there are some anomalies that I'm struggling with. When you spoke, for example, of reducing the power of the nation state, and I see the passion with which Ukrainians are absolutely dedicated to maintaining their nation state against formidable odds. The attachment to the nation state isn't something that one can just simply say, well, let's reduce the power of it. There is a longing for identity through the nation state, which the Ukrainian nation are presently embodying. And I find that disconcertingly at odds with the aspiration to reduce the power of the nation state. And when you speak about there was an innocent phrase that you said, if we were to make that happen. If we were to make that happen. The implication was that those of us in this session and millions of other people would make it happen in a kind of agency with a deliberate goal that we would bring about with the same power shift as every other power agency. So I think it's contrary to what you outlined as how change happens. Change doesn't happen if we were to make that happen. But you enlisted us for a few seconds in the we, and I was surprised at that. I would be grateful for your comment, because I don't wish to catch you out with a phrase. I am preoccupied with others in a network group in processes of dialogue that engage with the role, for example, of United Nations. And you yourself invoked the United Nations as an agency that would instill rights of nature. Well, that's a power that you're attributing to the United Nations, which is one of many powerful and important institutions. So I'm really interested in, when it comes down to it, what is the role of these agencies, which are already respectable, respected, and Guterres in the United Nations I think is extraordinary leader. Could you comment on some of those contradictions and the agency issue? Where is the power? Where is the power going to lie?
Well, thank you, Hugh. I love your questions. I really appreciate the insight you bring to both of those questions. They're really important, and they're not easy questions to answer by any means. But so what I can do is I can try to answer them with a general sense of principles, but they demand a lot more exploration. So that first question about the nation state, and we see in Ukraine exactly like what the power and passion that can ignite. But I think it's important to make the distinction between the nation and the nation state. Like all through history, ever since nomadic hunter-gatherers kind of led to larger like accumulations of people, there have been a sense of the nation. And say, like in North America, many Indian tribes call themselves, the Apache Nation or the Cheyenne Nation or whatever. What is more modern is not this kind of attachment to a group of people and caring passionately, belonging. That is a wonderful part of our humanity. But it's then imposing this statehood, this political statehood, on an artificial group, and then saying you are the nation. So we see in countries in European examples like Italy and Germany, and now somebody might feel like a passionate Italian or German. Actually, those were imposed. The very notions of Italy or Germany were ideas imposed by rulers on groups of people saying, okay, we're now this nation state. So similarly, if we can separate the nation out from the state, and we can actually see part of our identity, part of that fractal sense of identity being as part of a nation, but then recognizing that nation doesn't have to be locked in to all this political economic trappings of statehood, but a lot of those other power levels can be actually pushed down more to the grassroots or pushed to more larger geographies. That's the idea, because it's important for people to have that strong sense of attachment. So that's just one way of thinking about it, which, just as a more of a foundation for exploration. And of course, I just want to emphasize, I'm trying in these presentations to give a sense of a tangible feeling of what is doable, but I'm by no means trying to say this is a blueprint. And some of these questions, especially around the notion of UN, are hugely complex. And I agree with you that when we have established institutions, it doesn't necessarily make sense to say, throw it out and start again from scratch. But it does make sense to say, how can we sort of transform it, basically, so it kind of works in a way that, again, doesn't give all that power to the actual nation states themselves that exist right now. But anyway, good food for thought. And separately, I love what you say about the we. And who is we? Every time you ever hear anybody, including me or others, use the word we when they're writing articles or whatever, I encourage you always to say, wait a minute, who is we? And oftentimes we refers to people who are sometimes are defined as weird, according to the social psychologists. Like, weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Like, there's this way in which we are the people that we feel we look like and sound like, etc. So I think that's a fair question to ask. And I guess I was really looking into my own self when you asked that question. What did I mean by we? And I feel what I mean is there's a sense of a shared collective of people around the world who are pushing towards life-affirming future. And there's millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people like that. Paul Hawkins, in that classic book, Blessed Unrest, talked about the greatest global movement in history, millions of movements. That's who I think of as the we. And there's a larger we of all the other people who are not part of that movement, but actually who would, if they were not so conditioned by both the cultural conditioning that happens, and also the need to just get up and work and make ends meet and deal with the struggle, so they don't have a chance to actually think about some of these larger issues, because they've been forced by this oppressive system to have to like give every waking moment to try to stay alive. And so they're not by any means blocking what's going on, but they are being used by these sort of big powers to continue this kind of trajectory we're on. So I guess that's a larger we, but I really love what you question, and thank you. It causes me to look into myself, and I think we also do that every time we ever use that word. So I appreciate that, Hugh. Thank you. So Emma Mary, you raised your hand.
Yes, hello, Jeremy, and everybody. Yes, this thing about belonging to the nation state, one of the things that I've been studying recently is the concept of belonging to the earth, literally. And I myself have developed this, and in my earth listening stuff that I do, as you know, there's this sense of we do need to belong somewhere. And to me, belonging to the nation state probably came about as we lost our connection with the earth. Wherever we end up living, and I myself have lived all over the world, but wherever we end up living at this moment in time, we're maybe going to have a little bit of green something quite near us. If we're in a city, it might be the local park, or it could be the tree out the window on the sidewalk. But I do believe if we can develop a deep relationship with that tree, for example, and it becomes reciprocal. And there's such a feeling, a tangible feeling, that gives us a sense of belonging. I myself belong to these sacred Malvern Hills and my little bit of garden where I cultivate my vegetables. Beautiful. But that absolute sense of I so belong here, that if more of us are encouraged to belong to one little bit of the earth, Mother Earth, the sacred Mother Earth, then we're not going to need these nation states. That's my point.
I think that is a great reflection, Emma Mary. And that what I want to share to add to that, and so coming back to that great point that Hugh raised, is, and this is something I explore in my book, web of meaning in more detail. But it's this recognition that values themselves are a function of identity. And we can look at identity itself as being fractal. So if you kind of, like right now, our neoliberal system tells us that our identity is us as separate individuals, that's who we are. We're separate individuals, and that expands out to our family, and that's about it. And so with your identity is with yourself as an individual. Neoliberalism makes a lot of sense. It makes sense to outcompete others and to be free to do whatever you want. If you want to wear a mask or not wear a mask, it's my choice. I'm the individual. If your identity expands to community, your values will be different. They'll be based on values. Or your identity might expand to that sense of nation. And your values might be like patriotic values, might be around that. Or your identity could expand to an ideology. So you might, if you have a strong ideology, that could be a belief, a religion, or it could be a political ideology. Your identity will be that, and your values will be based on that. And it can extend to all of humanity. So those people for whose identity is I'm a human being, things like human rights become hugely valuable. And ultimately, to your point, Emma Mary, your identity can expand to all of life. To that, like that quote from Albert Schweitzer, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. Then your values will be based on what is affirming for life. But the point about it is not that one layer is right and the others are wrong. The point about it is that what is available to us as human beings is to recognize that our identity itself can actually flow fluidly at all those different layers. We are each of those layers. I am an individual, and I do care about, like, having good food on my plate this evening, whatever. I do care about my family, my community, all the way to life. But what we can do is recognize that once we see as human beings, we are fractally each of those layers, then we can start to pursue this notion of fractal flourishing, realizing that what is good for each of those layers of our identity can actually be arranged in a way that is good for all the layers. So it doesn't become this either or zero-sum game between one layer and another. So thank you to you both, Hugh and Emma, for raising that very important point. I do notice we're coming to our last minute of our masterclass. So maybe I'll turn over to you, Marianne, just to close for us right now.
Well, there was one question
Sure.
that was put that I wanted you to address, if possible, quickly and briefly.
Yeah.
How do you connect all these dots to the Earth Charter?
Well, Marianne, honestly, I think the person to answer that really should be you. So if I could ask you, if you, coming from all your work on the Earth Charter, from everything that we were just talking about, I'd love you to maybe close this with your own sense of how those connect with this incredible work that you and those of the Earth Charter are working on.
Yeah. Well, I thank you, Jeremy. Well, I think the Earth Charter offers a map, offers an ethical compass as we navigate through these questions, and as we navigate with the aim of reorienting the way in which human civilization is currently working towards something else. The way I see is that the current civilization that we have is ecologically illiterate and unethical illiterate civilization, and certainly without this planetary vision. And therefore, I see the Earth Charter as an instrument to help us expand our views and how we relate to this large living world. So with this, I would like to close and thank you, Jeremy, for your time, for this wonderful masterclass. I think there's a lot of food for thought. For those of you who are still here, I would like actually to invite you to say in a few words, to write in the chat box, if you feel like, in a few words, your feelings about this masterclass and your takeaways. How do you feel now after these 2 hours? I know we don't have time now to open the mic for everybody to say that, but I think I'm really encouraging you to take a moment to reflect and just write in a few words your feelings after this rich discussion. There is so much to take. I know some people have asked also about recordings. We have recorded, as you've seen, and we are figuring out a way to share the recordings and probably also the PowerPoint all together, because I think these are questions that people are asking, right, Jeremy?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. No, I totally agree. And really, just for my own final words, I just wanted to sort of add to what you were just saying, Marianne, about the Earth Charter. And honestly, and I write about this in the Web of Meaning too, I see the Earth Charter as really being the most important foundational ethical document that we have as a human society right now, for the very moral and ethical foundation of an ecological civilization. I mean, we can hardly improve on what has actually been created with that Earth Charter. And I could, in my own imaginings, I would see that as being almost like in the United States, this kind of sacredness given to the Constitution or whatever that was put together. Almost the Earth Charter can almost be understood in that way, like the sort of constitution, if you will, of what is possible for an ecological civilization.
Wonderful. Well, that's very inspiring. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. We have put there information about our upcoming masterclass. Actually, the next one in English is on the 16th of June, and it's going to be on the feminine intelligence. So you're all welcome to join us for this one or upcoming ones in other languages too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And have a good rest.